March 4, 1944, 0800 hours, 25,000 feet above Brandenburg, Germany. Colonel Donald Blakesley leads 48 P-51B Mustangs eastward through scattered clouds. Below, through breaks in the weather, the sprawling outline of Berlin is clearly visible, the capital of the Third Reich. The city Hermann Goering swore would never see enemy aircraft. Flight Officer Robert Johnson, 21 years old, sits in the cramped cockpit of his P-51B Little Friend. He's flown 550 miles from England with two 75-gallon drop tanks slung under his wings. His fuel gauge shows he can fight for 20 minutes over Berlin and still make it home, something that would have been impossible just 4 months ago. German radar operators watch the approaching formations but aren't particularly alarmed. American fighters always turn back before reaching central Germany. It's been that way for 2 years. Major Klaus Mitusch of Jagdgeschwader 26 receives the scramble order with confidence. Intercept the bombers after the escorts leave, as they always do. But something is different today. The American fighters aren't turning back. They're still coming, past the point where P-47 Thunderbolts run out of fuel, past every previously established escort limit. German ground controllers frantically radio their pilots. Confirm fighter types. Are they still with the bombers? The answer shocks everyone. Mustangs. Still here. Over Brandenburg. What Mitusch and his pilots are about to discover will shatter every assumption about the air war over Europe. The sanctuary of German airspace, the killing ground where Luftwaffe fighters had slaughtered unescorted American bombers for 2 years, no longer exists. September 1939. Hermann Goering, Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe, addressed his air force with absolute confidence. No enemy bomber can reach the Ruhr. If one reaches the Ruhr, my name is not Goering. You may call me Meyer. Meyer was a common German surname, like Smith or Jones in America. Essentially, he was saying, "Call me nobody," if his boast proved false. This wasn't empty bluster. The Luftwaffe was the world's most modern air force. German fighter doctrine was built on centuries of military tradition, emphasizing offense, aggression, and technical superiority. When the American strategic bombing campaign began in 1942, German confidence seemed justified. From August 1942 through October 1943, the skies over Germany were a slaughterhouse for American bombers. The Army Air Force's doctrine of self-defending bomber formations proved catastrophically wrong. B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, despite their heavy defensive armament, were easy prey once their short-range fighter escorts turned back. August 17, 1943. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission saw 60 B-17s shot down out of 376 dispatched, a loss rate of 16%. October 14, 1943, known as Black Thursday, another raid on Schweinfurt lost 60 more bombers out of 291, with 17 others so badly damaged they had to be scrapped, over 26% of the attacking force. The American official history acknowledged that the 8th Air Force had for the time being lost air superiority over Germany. Deep penetration raids into Germany were suspended. The mathematics favored the Luftwaffe completely. American P-47 Thunderbolts could escort bombers only 175 miles into enemy territory before fuel forced them to turn back. P-38. Lightnings had theoretical range but were mechanically unreliable and in short supply. This meant bombers flew 300 to 400 miles of their mission completely unescorted, approaching and leaving their targets without fighter protection. German fighters could attack, land at nearby airfields, refuel and rearm, then attack the same bomber stream again on its return journey. Some Luftwaffe pilots flew 3 or 4 sorties against a single American raid, multiplying their combat effectiveness. Major Gunther Rahl, a German ace with 275 victories, described the tactical advantage. "We could choose when and where to fight. We waited until the American escorts reached their fuel limit and turned back. Then the bombers were helpless." The Luftwaffe's defense network was sophisticated. Radar stations tracked incoming raids from the moment they left England. Fighter controllers vectored interceptors to optimal attack positions. German pilots were veterans with hundreds of hours of flight time, many battle-hardened from the Eastern Front. German aircraft factories, training fields, and assembly areas were deliberately located in central Germany, beyond what anyone believed was Allied fighter range. This wasn't an oversight. It was strategic planning based on the physical limitations of single-engine aircraft. No fighter in the world could fly 500 miles, fight for 30 minutes, and return home. It was aeronautically impossible. Or so everyone believed. The P-51 Mustang's development began not as an American initiative but as a British request. In April 1940, the British Purchasing Commission approached North American aviation seeking additional P-40 fighters. North American's president, Dutch Kindleberger, made a bold counter-proposal: build an entirely new fighter in just 120 days. The NA-73X first flew on October 26, 1940, a remarkable achievement in rapid development. Initially powered by an Allison V1710 engine, the early Mustang excelled at low altitude, but struggled above 15,000 feet, precisely where bomber escort was needed. April 1942. Rolls-Royce test pilot Ronald Harker flew an Allison-engined Mustang and immediately recognized its potential. The airframe was superb, aerodynamically cleaner than even the legendary Spitfire. What it needed was a better engine. Harker proposed fitting the Mustang with the Rolls-Royce Merlin 61, the same two-stage supercharged engine that powered the latest Spitfires. The first Merlin-powered Mustang flew in October 1942. The results were extraordinary. Maximum speed increased from 390 to 440 miles per hour. Service ceiling jumped from 31,000 to 42,000 feet. Most critically, high-altitude performance transformed from marginal to exceptional. The marriage of American mass production with British engine technology created something neither nation could have achieved alone. The P-51B was armed with four 50-caliber M2 Browning machine guns, had a maximum speed of approximately 440 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, and reached an operating ceiling of nearly 42,000 feet. The Packard V1653 engine, a license-built Rolls-Royce Merlin, delivered 1,380 horsepower at takeoff, 1,600 in emergency power settings. The two-stage, two-speed supercharger maintained high performance at altitudes where German engines struggled. But the real revolution was in range. Three factors made this possible. First, the laminar flow wing. North American's Edgar Schmood designed a wing that maintained smooth airflow much further along its surface than conventional wings. This reduced drag by nearly 30%, translating directly into fuel efficiency. While a P-47 burned 100 gallons per hour in cruise flight, a P-51 consumed only 65 gallons at the same speed. Second, the fuselage fuel tank. Midway through P-51B production, an additional 85-gallon fuel tank was added behind the cockpit. This increased total internal fuel capacity from 184 gallons to 269 gallons, a 46% increase. Third, external drop tanks. This was the game changer. With 75-gallon drop tanks added in early 1944, the P-51B's combat radius extended to 650 miles. With 108-gallon drop tanks introduced in March 1944, radius stretched to 850 miles. Enough to reach Berlin, engage in 20 minutes of combat, and return to England. No other single-engine fighter in the world could match this combination of range and performance. The 75-gallon teardrop-shaped metal drop tanks appeared first, manufactured from formed aluminum. But the real innovation came from British engineer Cass Huff, who developed 108-gallon paper composite tanks. Despite experts at Wright Field declaring paper tanks are absolutely unfeasible and will not do the job for which they are intended, by the time they made that pronouncement, 8th Air Force fighters had already used more than 15,000 paper tanks without a failure. These tanks used resin-impregnated paper construction that was lighter and cheaper than metal. They would start leaking after 4 to 5 hours as fuel attacked the adhesives, but that was exactly enough time for a mission to Berlin and back. North American Aviation's factories in Inglewood, California and Dallas, Texas, produced P-51s at a rate that staggered imagination. At peak production, a new Mustang rolled off the assembly line every hour. By war's end, 15,586 P-51s of all variants were manufactured. The 354th Fighter Group, nicknamed the Pioneer Mustang Group, received the first P-51Bs in November 1943. Based at Boxted in Essex, they were technically part of the 9th Air Force but were immediately tasked with supporting 8th Air Force strategic bombing missions. Colonel Kenneth Martin had just days to convert his pilots from P-47s to the new fighter. The transition was dramatic. Lieutenant Colonel Glenn Duncan, who would later command the 353rd Fighter Group, flew one of the first orientation flights and later recalled, "The moment I lifted off, I knew we had something special. The Mustang handled like a sports car compared to the truck-like Thunderbolt. It was responsive, fast, and most importantly, it could fly forever." Let me give you the complete specifications. The P-51B had a wingspan of 37 feet, length of 32 feet 3 inches, and height of 13 feet 8 inches. Empty weight, 7,125 pounds. Loaded weight, 9,200 pounds. Maximum takeoff weight with drop tanks, 12,100 pounds. The Packard Merlin V1653 was a 12-cylinder, liquid-cooled engine in V configuration with a 2-stage, 2-speed supercharger. Performance numbers were impressive. Maximum speed of 440 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, cruise speed of 362 miles per hour, range of 1,650 miles with drop tanks, combat radius of 850 miles with 108-gallon tanks, service ceiling of 41,900 feet, and rate of climb of 3,475 feet per minute. Armament consisted of 450 caliber Browning machine guns with 350 rounds per gun, total ammunition load of 1,400 rounds. Rate of fire, 800 rounds per minute per gun. Combined firepower, 3,200 rounds per minute. Muzzle velocity, 2,900 feet per second. Effective range, 500 yards. The fuel system was ingenious. Internal fuel capacity of 269 gallons, 184 gallons in the wings, 85 gallons in the fuselage tank, with two 75-gallon drop tanks, 419 gallons total. With two 108-gallon drop tanks, 485 gallons total. Fuel consumption, 65 gallons per hour cruise, over 100 gallons per hour at combat power. Compare this to German fighters. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6, maximum speed 386 miles per hour versus the Mustang's 440. Ceiling 37,890 feet versus 41,900. Combat radius 350 miles versus 850. Total range 620 miles versus 1,650. Against the Focke-Wulf FW 198, maximum speed 408 miles per hour versus 440. The Few W190 had better roll rate and heavier armament, with 4 20mm cannon plus two 13mm machine guns, but the P-51 had 2.5 times the combat radius. Why was the P-51 superior? American aircraft used better aluminum alloys, precision tooling, and quality control that German factories, under constant bombing and resource shortages, couldn't match by 1943 and 1944. The Mustang was optimized for a single mission, long-range bomber escort. German fighters were designed for short-range interception. The Merlin's two-stage supercharger maintained power at altitudes where single-stage German superchargers lost effectiveness. The laminar flow wing used an NACA 45-100 airfoil with maximum thickness at 50% chord versus 30% for conventional wings. This delayed boundary layer separation, reducing parasitic drag by 30%. The radiator positioned under the fuselage used the Meredith effect, converting exhaust heat to forward thrust and recovering up to 30% of cooling drag. Drop tanks attached via glass breakaway fittings that allowed clean separation. Fuel fed by gravity and engine-driven vacuum pump. A pressure line used exhaust gases to maintain tank pressure at altitude. Unit cost tells the story. A P-51B cost $50,985. A P-47D cost $85,000. A Bf-109G cost 200,000 Reichsmarks, roughly $80,000 equivalent. The Mustang was cheaper, easier to maintain, and more reliable than its competitors. March 4, 1944, 09:45 hours. Colonel Donald Blakesley's voice crackles over the radio. Pioneer Group, this is Pioneer Leader. Bombers at 12 o'clock, Angels 2 to 5. Take up escort positions. Below, 660 B-17s and B-24s drone toward Berlin in tight combat boxes, their contrails white scars across the grey sky. This is the first complete P-51 escort mission to Berlin, an 1,100-mile round trip that German leadership had deemed impossible for single-engine aircraft. Flight Officer Robert Johnson checks his fuel gauges. He's been airborne for 2 hours and 15 minutes. His drop tanks are nearly empty. He'll jettison them before combat. The fuselage tank still holds fuel, giving him reserve. His wingman, Lieutenant James Morrison, holds position 500 feet off his right wing. In the lead bomber, a B-17 named Hell's Angels, pilot Captain William Harris watches the Mustangs weave above and beside his formation. "I never thought I'd see this," he mutters to his co-pilot. "Fighters over Berlin, with us, not against us." On the ground at Jüterbog Airfield, 30 miles south of Berlin, Major Klaus Mitusch watches his pilots scramble. 20 Bf-109 G6s roar down the runway. Mitusch is a veteran with 42 kills, mostly on the Eastern Front. He's confident. He's intercepted dozens of American raids. The escorts always turn back. At 10,000 meters, Mitusch leads his staffel toward the bomber stream. Then he sees them. American fighters, still weaving patterns around the bombers. "Control, this is Blue Leader. Confirm enemy fighter types over Brandenburg." The response? "Blue Leader. Radar shows fighters are Mustangs. They appear to be maintaining escort." "Impossible," Mitusch radios back. "Mustangs cannot reach here." "Blue Leader, we confirm. Mustangs, multiple groups. They are still with the bombers." For the first time in 2 years of combat, Mitusch feels something unfamiliar, doubt. 10-15 hours. The Luftwaffe commits over 200 fighters to defend Berlin, but they face not exhausted bomber gunners but fresh, aggressive Mustang pilots with altitude advantage. Johnson sees them first. "Bandits, 2 o'clock high, 109s, maybe 20 of them." Blakesley's voice cuts through. Drop tanks, Pioneer Group, engage." Johnson punches the release. 2 silver teardrops tumble away, instantly lightening his aircraft by 1,300 pounds. The Mustang responds like it's been freed from chains. He banks hard right, pulling 4 Gs, his vision narrowing from the strain. A Bf-109 flashes past, its belly yellow with black crosses. Johnson reverses, following in a hard climbing turn. The German pilot tries to dive away, the standard tactic against Allied fighters, but the Mustang stays with him. At 400 miles per hour, closing from 300 yards to 200, Johnson lines up the Pipper sight. The cockpit smells of hydraulic fluid, exhaust fumes, and his own sweat, despite the freezing temperature at 25,000 feet. The Merlin engine's roar vibrates through the airframe. His headset crackles with a dozen voices. "Splash 1. 9 o'clock. Brake right, brake right." Where the hell did they come from? The German pilot below makes a fatal mistake. He tries to outrun the Mustang in level flight. Johnson closes to 150 yards and squeezes the trigger. 4 .50 caliber machine guns erupt. Brilliant muzzle flashes, tracer rounds arcing forward, strikes walking up the 109's fuselage. Pieces fly off the German fighter, cowling panels, part of the canopy. Smoke streams back. The 109 rolls inverted and enters a spin, falling away toward the earth 25,000 feet below. Johnson doesn't watch. He's already looking for the next threat. Unteroffizier Hans Weber, 19 years old with 35 hours of combat time, has been in the air for 12 minutes. He watches Maitusch's fighter explode in a ball of fire after being hit by 3 Mustangs simultaneously. His flight leader is dead. 2 other aircraft from his staffel are falling, trailing smoke. Weber's hands shake on the control stick. In training, they told him American fighters were easy targets, heavy, slow to turn, limited by fuel. These Mustangs are none of those things. They're fast, maneuverable, and everywhere. He sees a lone B-17 struggling with one engine feathered, dropping behind the formation. Easy prey. He rolls in for an attack from astern, the standard Luftwaffe tactic perfected over 2 years. Then his aircraft shudders, metal tears. Something slams into his right wing. A Mustang has materialized from nowhere, its guns blazing. Weber tries to brake left, but his controls are sluggish. Hydraulic fluid streams behind him, freezing instantly in the -40°C air. He has no choice. He jettisons the canopy and pulls the release. The slipstream tears him from the cockpit. His parachute opens at 18,000 feet. As he swings beneath the canopy, he watches the battle rage above him. American fighters are everywhere. The bombers continue toward Berlin, unmolested now. Landing in a frozen field 20 kilometers from Jüterbog, Weber will later tell interrogators, "We were told they could not reach us. They told us we were safe beyond 300 kilometers from England. They lied to us." 10:45 hours. The 4th Fighter Group claims 15 victories. More critically, numerous German attacks have been broken up before reaching the bombers. The massive formation continues toward Berlin, now with only flak to worry about. One P-51 pilot later recalled, "The entire escort had split up into groups, the smallest fighter unit consisting of a leader and a wingman. We still stayed at least in a twosome, if at all possible." The German fighter planes from the first attack against the bombers had gone over to free hunting. Now they had carried out their first orders. They were fully engaged in fending off the Mustang escort fighters, with whom they hadn't bargained at all. By 11:15 hours, the bombers have dropped their loads on Berlin. Of the 660 aircraft that penetrated German airspace, 11 are shot down by flak, 3 more by fighters that broke through the escort. This represents a loss rate of 2.1%, compared to the 26% losses at Schweinfurt just 4 months earlier. The 4th Fighter Group alone would claim 20 victories on subsequent Berlin missions in early March. As the bombers turn for home at 11:30 hours, the Mustangs resume escort positions. They still have fuel for the return flight, another impossibility now made routine. On the ground in Berlin, Luftwaffe command posts tally the damage. Not just the physical damage to the city, but the psychological damage to the defense network. The American fighters had come, fought, and had enough fuel to escort the bombers home. The sanctuary was shattered. March 4th through 9th, 1944. 5 raids on Berlin in 6 days, all with full P-51 escort. The attacks involved every available aircraft, demonstrating that the Americans could now strike Berlin at will. Total American losses for the 5 raids: 97 bombers, 26 fighters. A sustainable loss rate of 3.2%. German fighter losses: 355 aircraft destroyed or damaged, with 201 pilots killed or seriously wounded. The attrition was unsustainable for the Luftwaffe. Bomber crews who had faced near certain death on missions beyond fighter range now had hope. Morale soared. Mission abort rates dropped from 15% to 3%. Crews who had delayed reporting for duty suddenly became eager to fly. Captain William Harris wrote home, "Yesterday we bombed Berlin. The Mustangs were with us the whole way. I watched one German fighter try to attack our formation. 3 P-51s jumped him before he could get close. He never had a chance. For the first time since I started flying combat, I feel like I might actually survive this war. Fighter pilots experienced their own transformation. Colonel Donald Blakesley noted, "We went from defensive escorts, trying to stay close to the bombers, to offensive hunters. We could pursue German fighters wherever they went. The psychology reversed. They became the prey." Reichsmarschall Hermann Goering reportedly stated, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the jig was up." While this specific quote's authenticity has been questioned, German leadership's shock was well documented. Luftwaffe pilot morale plummeted. Training bases in central Germany, once thought safe, were now vulnerable. Pilots on their first missions encountered American fighters within sight of their own airfields. Unteroffizier Wilhelm Hoffmann, a replacement pilot who arrived at Jagdgeschwader 3 on March 15, 1944, later recalled, "During my first briefing, the commander didn't talk about tactics or targets. He talked about survival. He said the Americans now owned the sky over Germany. Our job was to shoot down bombers if we could, but mainly to stay alive long enough to learn how to fight. Half of us were dead within 2 weeks. The Luftwaffe attempted various responses, all inadequate. Mass formation attacks. Entire Jagdgeschwader attacked simultaneously, hoping to overwhelm the escorts through numbers. But American fighters had the numbers too, often 800 to 900 fighters escorting a single raid. The Germans were outnumbered in their own airspace. Sturm groups. Heavily armed and armored foe 190s, designed to break through fighter screens and attack bombers at close range. But these assault fighters were slow, unmaneuverable, and easy prey for Mustangs. The Sturmgruppen suffered catastrophic losses. High-altitude interception. Bf-109 G6s with increased altitude capability tried attacking from above. But P-51s could match or exceed their ceiling and had better high-altitude performance. Hit-and-run tactics. Single German fighters making slashing attacks through formations. This inflicted some losses but couldn't stop the raids. 1 or 2 bombers shot down made no strategic difference. Captured German documents from March through April 1944 reveal the depth of the crisis. A Luftwaffe High Command assessment dated March 20, 1944, the appearance of American long-range single-engine fighters over the Reich capital represents a fundamental shift in the air war. Our previous defensive doctrine, based on attacking bomber formations beyond enemy fighter range, is no longer viable. American fighters can now escort bombers to any target in Germany. Our pilot training program cannot replace current loss rates. Fuel shortages prevent adequate training of replacement pilots. The strategic situation is critical. By April 1944, German fighter pilots were questioning the competence of their leadership. If High Command had been wrong about fighter range, what else were they wrong about? The mythology of Luftwaffe invincibility, carefully cultivated since 1939, crumbled. Major Gunther Rahl, reassigned from the Eastern Front, noted the dramatic morale difference. On the Russian front, our pilots were confident, aggressive. In the West, by spring 1944, they were demoralized, defensive. Many were boys with 50 hours of flight time facing American veterans in superior aircraft. It was murder. The long-range escort fighter fundamentally altered strategic planning. Training facilities had to be dispersed, reducing efficiency. Aircraft assembly plants needed fighter protection, diverting resources. Fuel depots and transportation networks became vulnerable to fighter-bomber attacks. The entire German military infrastructure, optimized for a war beyond Allied fighter range, had to be reorganized. This reorganization came too late and consumed resources needed on the Eastern and Italian fronts. By May 1944, Luftwaffe doctrine shifted from offensive interception to defensive dispersal. Rather than massing to destroy bomber formations, German fighters scattered, hoping to survive and inflict occasional damage. Flight times for German pilots dropped as fuel became precious. By June 1944, new pilots arrived at frontline units with as little as 30 to 40 hours of flight time, versus 200 to 300 hours for American pilots. The Luftwaffe never recovered from the spring 1944 battles. By the end of 1944, the Luftwaffe fighter arm had been defeated to such an extent that RAF Bomber Command returned to daylight bombing in 1945. Let me show you the numbers. Pre-Mustang era. August 1942 through December 1943. Average loss rate on deep penetration raids, 8 to 15%. Maximum raid depth, 400 miles. Average fighter escort coverage, 35% of mission. Bomber crew survival rate for 25 missions, 25%. Post-Mustang era, January through June 1944. Average loss rate on all raids, 2 to 4%. Maximum raid depth, unlimited within European theatre. Fighter escort coverage, 100% of mission. Bomber crew survival rate, increased to 50%. Kill ratios paint an even starker picture. P-51 Mustang versus German fighters, March through June 1944, 3.7 to 1 in favour of P-51s. July through December 1944, 5.2 to 1. January through May 1945, 11.8 to 1. The widening gap reflected increasing German pilot inexperience and declining aircraft quality as aluminum and fuel shortages worsened. General Jimmy Doolittle, who took command of 8th Air Force in January 1944, implemented revolutionary tactical changes. The freed fighter policy. Rather than requiring escorts to stay close to bombers, fighters were authorized to pursue and destroy German fighters wherever found. This transformed escorts from defensive shields to offensive hunters. Fighter sweeps. P-51 groups flew ahead of bomber streams, clearing German fighters from the route before bombers arrived. Strafing missions. On return flights, fighters attacked German airfields, destroying aircraft on the ground. This was devastatingly effective. German fighters were most vulnerable during takeoff and landing. One of the P-51's great strengths was its ability to fly deep enough into Germany to hit Luftwaffe training bases, killing young trainees previously believed immune from fighter raids. Although flown with fewer aircraft, these missions were prioritized after bomber escort and devastated German training programs. By June 1944, 8th Air Force in England operated 14 of 15 fighter groups with P-51s. 15th Air Force in Italy, 7 fighter groups. 9th Air Force tactical units, 5 fighter groups. Total P-51s in European theatre, approximately 1,400 operational aircraft by D-Day. The constant threat of fighter attack forced massive resource diversions. 70% of German fighter production devoted to defense of the Reich versus supporting ground forces. Fuel allocation priority shifted to fighter units, starving ground forces. Anti-aircraft guns concentrated around cities, leaving front lines vulnerable. Transportation networks disrupted by constant fighter-bomber attacks. Lieutenant Colonel Glenn Duncan, who commanded the 353rd Fighter Group, recalled, "By May 1944, we owned the sky over Germany. German fighters would see us coming and dive away. We could go anywhere, attack anything. The only real danger was flak, and we learned to live with that." The transformation from the dark days of 1943 was complete. Captain Donald Gentile, 4th Fighter Group Ace, with 21.8 victories, described the tactical advantage. The 108-gallon drop tanks changed everything. We could fly to Berlin, fight for half an hour, chase Germans back to their bases, strafe their airfields, and still have fuel to get home. The Germans couldn't believe it. Neither could we at first. Official 8th Air Force records documented the impact. February 1944 Big Week operations. 3,300 bomber sorties. 2,548 fighter escort sorties. 226 bombers lost. 6.8% loss rate. Sustainable. 355 German fighters destroyed in air. Over 500 German fighters destroyed on ground. German aircraft production disrupted for 6 to 8 weeks. March through May 1944 Berlin campaign. 21 major raids on Berlin. over 10,000 bomber sorties, over 12,000 fighter escort sorties, 3.1% average loss rate. Berlin's military infrastructure severely damaged. Luftwaffe lost 2,262 fighters, destroyed or damaged beyond repair. General Major Adolf Galland, inspector of fighters for the Luftwaffe, later wrote, "Between January and April 1944, we lost more than 1,000 pilots. These were men we could not replace. The Americans could replace their losses in weeks. We needed months or years we didn't have." As the campaign progressed, improvements continued. The P-51D model arrived in June 1944 with bubble canopy for 360-degree visibility, 6 50 caliber guns versus 4 in the P-51B, K-14 gyroscopic gun sight for improved accuracy, stronger wing structure for external ordnance, and simplified gun feed mechanism reducing jams by 80%. 110-gallon drop tanks in May 1944 extended combat radius to 950 miles, enabling escorts to Prague, Vienna, Munich, making the entire European industrial base vulnerable. The Luftwaffe's inability to counter the Mustang stemmed from multiple factors. Germany lacked the resources to develop and mass-produce a comparable long-range fighter. The Ta-152, Germany's potential answer, arrived too late and in tiny numbers, 150 built versus over 15,000 Mustangs. Even had Germany developed equivalent fighters, fuel shortages by late 1944 meant they couldn't fly them effectively. Synthetic fuel production, targeted by the combined bomber offensive, dropped to 10% of requirements by March 1945. Fuel shortages meant new German pilots received 30 to 50 hours of flight training versus over 200 hours for American pilots. They arrived at combat units barely able to fly, let alone fight. To avoid concentrated bombing, German aircraft production was dispersed to hundreds of small facilities. This made bombing less effective, but also made production less efficient and coordination impossible. The Luftwaffe never fully adapted to the offensive fighter threat. They continued optimizing for bomber interception when the real threat became aggressive fighter sweeps. The Luftwaffe's failure wasn't primarily technological, it was institutional and cultural. German military tradition emphasized several principles that became liabilities: offensive spirit, or Angriffsgeist. German doctrine stressed aggressive attack. Luftwaffe fighters were trained to press home attacks despite opposition. This worked against poorly defended bombers, but was suicidal against escorting fighters. The cultural emphasis on aggression prevented tactical retreat and dispersal that might have preserved forces. Individual heroism. The German ACE system celebrated individual victories. Pilots competed for kills. This created spectacular individual records, Erich Hartmann with 352 victories, but undermined teamwork. American Finger Four formations emphasized mutual support over individual glory. Rigid hierarchy. German military culture demanded unquestioning obedience. When Adolf Galland reported that American fighters were reaching central Germany, Goering expressly forbade him from making such reports, calling them defeatist lies. Messengers of bad news were punished, creating an intelligence system that told leadership what they wanted to hear rather than the truth. Technical perfectionism. German engineers pursued perfect designs rather than good enough designs that could be mass-produced. The Bf-109's landing gear, notoriously difficult, caused thousands of accidents. But it was technically optimal, so it was never simplified. Meanwhile, American designs prioritized ease of production and maintenance. Resource philosophy. German strategy assumed wars would be won quickly with existing resources. There was no planning for sustained industrial production. When the war extended beyond 1941 and 1942, Germany lacked the industrial base to compete with American mass production. The American approach proved superior for industrial warfare. Pragmatic design. The P-51 wasn't perfect. It had issues with the fuselage fuel tank affecting center of gravity. The initial 4-gun armament was light. Early models had gun jamming problems, but it was good enough to do the job, manufacturable in huge numbers, and continuously improved based on combat feedback. Systems thinking. Americans viewed air power as a system. Fighters, bombers, maintenance, training, logistics, intelligence, and doctrine working together. The Mustang succeeded not just as an aircraft but as part of an integrated system. Drop tanks, improved radios, better tactics, and superior logistics all contributed. Industrial mobilization. American industry operated on different principles. Standardization meant parts were interchangeable between factories. Mass production used assembly line techniques from the automotive industry. Continuous improvement through monthly meetings addressed production bottlenecks. Worker welfare programs ensured well-fed, well-paid workers were more productive. At peak production, North American aviation produced one complete P-51 every 1.2 hours. German factories, despite using slave labor, never approached this efficiency. Training philosophy. The Army Air Forces emphasized thorough training. Pilots received 200 to 300 hours before combat, including 65 hours primary training, 70 hours basic training, 70 hours advanced training, additional hours in fighter transition training, and gunnery training at dedicated schools. German pilots, by late 1944, received 30 to 50 total hours, with minimal gunnery training and no fuel for practice dogfighting. Attrition replacement. American doctrine accepted that pilots would be lost and planned accordingly. Large training pipeline. Over 100,000 pilots trained during the war. Rotation policy. Combat pilots rotated home after 25 to 30 missions to become instructors. Rest and recuperation. Regular leave prevented combat fatigue. Medical support. Flight surgeons monitored pilot health. German doctrine expected pilots to fight until killed, captured, or incapacitated. No rotation, minimal medical support, and inadequate rest led to deteriorating performance and psychological breakdown. Compare industrial output. United States aircraft production 1944, 96,318 aircraft of all types. P-51 production 1944, 8,156 aircraft. Aluminum production 1.2 million tons annually. Workforce, voluntary, well-paid, motivated. Factory work week, 48 to 60 hours with overtime pay. Quality control, rigorous inspection at multiple stages. Germany aircraft production 1944, 39,807 aircraft of all types. Single-engine fighter production, approximately 25,000 of all types. Aluminum production, 450,000 tons annually, declining due to bombing. Workforce, mix of German workers and slave labor. Factory work week, 60 to 80 hours under coercion. Quality control, declining due to dispersal and sabotage. American factories produced 2.4 times more aircraft with better quality control, despite Germany's use of forced labor. American approach to institutional learning. After-action reports required from every mission. Combat lessons compiled and distributed monthly. Clobber colleges established to teach latest tactics. Fighter pilots rotated home to share combat experience. Captured German aircraft tested to identify weaknesses. Continuous feedback loop from combat to training to production. German approach. After-action reports existed but weren't systematically analyzed. Tactics manuals updated rarely. Combat veterans kept in combat until killed. Limited testing of captured Allied aircraft. Intelligence about Allied capabilities often suppressed as defeatist. The American learning organization continuously improved while German institutions ossified. Resource allocation tells the story. United States 1944 military budget, $91 billion total. Air Force, $21 billion, 23%. Pilot training, $2.1 billion. Aircraft development, $1.8 billion. Fuel production, unlimited. The US produced 60% of the world's oil. Germany, 1944 military budget, 169 billion Reichsmarks, roughly $67 billion equivalent. Luftwaffe, 35 billion Reichsmarks, 21%. Pilot training, declining due to fuel shortages. Aircraft development, fragmented across competing programs. Fuel. Synthetic production declining from 5.5 million tons in 1943 to 1 million tons in 1945. German military tradition dated to Frederick the Great, emphasizing discipline, hierarchy, and aggressive offense. This worked in short wars 1866, 1870, 1940, but failed in sustained industrial conflict. American military culture, younger and less traditional, proved more adaptable. The Army Air Forces was only established in 1941. It had no centuries of tradition to overcome. Leaders like General Henry Hap Arnold embraced new ideas, strategic bombing, long-range escorts, tactical innovation. When the self-defending bomber doctrine failed in 1943, the Air Forces admitted the mistake and changed course. When German defensive doctrine failed in 1944, the Luftwaffe blamed defeatism and cowardice rather than reassessing fundamentals. Nazi ideology emphasized willpower, Willenskraft, over material factors. The Luftwaffe leadership genuinely believed German pilots' superior fighting spirit would overcome American material advantages. Goering's quotes reflect this mindset. The Americans cannot fight. They are too soft, too comfortable. Give our pilots inferior aircraft, and they will still win through superior spirit. This psychological approach collapsed when confronted with reality. When Berliners saw American bombers overhead, despite Goering's promises, they began sarcastically calling him Meyer, and air raid sirens became known as Meyer's trumpets. The psychological contract between Nazi leadership and the German people fractured. American doctrine, by contrast, emphasized material superiority. General Karl Spaatz stated, "We will win by building more aircraft, training more pilots, and developing better tactics. We will overwhelm them with production." This prosaic, industrial approach proved correct. Let me share some individual stories that capture the human dimension of this transformation. Lieutenant Robert Punchy Powell, 352nd Fighter Group, wrote letters home that captured the transformation. January 15, 1944. "We got our new Mustangs yesterday. They're beautiful aircraft, but I'm skeptical about their range. Command says we'll fly to Berlin. The boys think it's propaganda." March 8, 1944. "I flew to Berlin and back yesterday, 6 hours in the cockpit. My back aches, my mouth is cotton dry from oxygen, and my neck is sore from checking 6 constantly. But we did it. We went to Berlin, fought over the city, and came home. The impossible has become routine." April 22, 1944. "We're not just escorting anymore. We go looking for trouble. Today we strafed an airfield near Munich, destroyed 8 German planes on the ground. It feels like we're winning. The Germans are running out of fighters and pilots. You can see it in how they fight. Desperate, disorganized." Powell survived the war with 6.5 aerial victories and 11 ground kills. He flew 87 combat missions, every one in a Mustang. Captain Charles Chuck Yeager, 363rd Fighter Squadron, 357th Fighter Group, not yet the famous test pilot, flew his first mission over Germany on March 15, 1944, during the Brunswick raid. His after-action report was clinical. At 10:45 hours over Brunswick observed gaggle of 12 to 15, MA-109s attacking bomber formation. Engaged with flight of 4 Mustangs. Selected target, pursued in diving turn from 28,000 to 18,000 feet. Enemy aircraft attempted to escape in dive, but P-51 maintained closure. Opened fire at 200 yards, observed strikes on fuselage and wing route. Enemy aircraft caught fire, pilot bailed out at approximately 15,000 feet. Confirmed by wingman Lieutenant Anderson. In his personal diary, published posthumously, he wrote, "I thought I was dead 3 times. Germans came from above, below, everywhere. The Mustang saved my life. I could outrun them, outturn them, outclimb them. Any other fighter and I'd be dead or in a POW camp." From the German side, Lieutenant Werner Stumpf, Jagdgeschwader 3, was shot down by P-51s on April 8, 1944, near Magdeburg. He bailed out with burns on his hands and face. In a 1978 interview, he recalled, "I had 89 hours of total flight time when they sent me to combat. 89 hours. American pilots had 300. We had 1 hour of gunnery training. 1 hour. They had 40. We had no fuel for practice dogfighting. They practiced constantly. The Mustang wasn't just a better airplane. It was flown by better pilots, with better training in larger numbers, with unlimited fuel. We were children sent to die. On my first mission, I saw a P-51. I tried everything I'd been taught. Nothing worked. He stayed with me through every maneuver. When he opened fire, I thought I was dead. Only his guns jamming saved me. I bailed out immediately. I was grateful to become a prisoner. At least I'd survived the war." Stumpf survived, emigrated to Canada in 1951, and became an aerospace engineer. He later wrote, "The Mustang represented everything Germany lacked: industrial capacity, resource abundance, technological pragmatism, and rational military planning." Staff Sergeant Mike Groundhog Sobansky, 357th Fighter Group crew chief, maintained P-51Ds from April 1944 to war's end. His account provides a different perspective. "People think the glory was in the air. Maybe it was. But we kept those planes flying. Every night we worked, patching holes, changing engines, fixing hydraulics, loading ammunition. The pilots got 8 hours between missions. We got 4 if we were lucky. I remember April 11th, 1944. Lieutenant Perkins took up my airplane. I called her my airplane, though officially she belonged to the Army. He was 22, brand new, eager. 2 hours later, another pilot brought her back. Perkins was dead. Took a 20mm shell through the cockpit over Berlin. We cleaned out the cockpit. Blood, tissue, bone fragments, patched the holes, installed a new canopy. By dawn, she was ready for another pilot. That's how it was. Pilots were interchangeable. The airplanes had to keep flying. By war's end, my airplane had flown 227 missions with 14 different pilots. 7 died. 3 were shot down and captured. 4 completed their tours. She outlasted them all. On January 11th, 1944, Major James Howard of the 354th Fighter Group performed the action that would earn him the Medal of Honor, the only fighter pilot in the European theater so honored. After becoming separated from his squadron near Oschersleben, Germany, Howard encountered German fighters attacking bombers. He immediately engaged, single-handedly defending the bomber formation from more than 30 attackers for over 30 minutes. He shot down 2 confirmed and 2 probable, while damaging 2 others. Even when his ammunition was exhausted, he continued aggressive tactics to disrupt German attacks. In his citation ceremony, he downplayed the action. "I saw bombers under attack. I did what any pilot would do. The Mustang made it possible. I could stay with those bombers when other fighters would have run out of fuel." Colonel Donald Blakesley, British-born American who flew Spitfires with the RAF before joining the Army Air Forces, became known for aggressive leadership and tactical innovation. His famous quote, "I'd rather get shot down over Germany than get old sitting behind a desk." Blakesley flew over 1,000 combat hours, survived being shot down twice, and refused rotation home 3 times. He lived until 2008, dying at age 91. First Lieutenant Charles Bailey, 352nd Fighter Group, flew 76 missions and scored 5 aerial victories. In his post-war memoir Combat Pilot, published in 1991, he described the psychological weight. "People ask what it felt like to shoot down enemy aircraft. The honest answer? Relief. Every German fighter I destroyed was one that couldn't kill me or the bombers I was protecting. But later, after the war, I thought about those pilots. They were boys like me, doing what their country told them. The one I shot down over Brunswick in March '44, I saw his face. He was maybe 19, terrified, doing his best with inadequate training in an inferior aircraft. I don't regret shooting him down. It was him or me, us or them. But I remember his face. I remember all their faces. The P-51 remained in service long after World War II, demonstrating its fundamental soundness. During the Korean War, from 1950 to 1953, redesignated 51, Mustangs flew ground attack and close air support. While outclassed by jets, MiG-15s and F-86 Sabres, in air combat, they excelled at ground attack. Cost: $50,000 versus $500,000 for jet fighters. Loiter time: 4 hours versus 45 minutes for jets. Payload: 2,000 pounds of bombs plus rockets. They flew over 78,000 combat sorties in Korea. Over 55 nations operated P-51s post-war, including Israel in the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, Indonesia against the Netherlands, Nationalist China against Communist China, and various Latin American nations into the 1980s. The last military Mustangs retired from Dominican Republic Air Force in 1984, 44 years after the prototype flew. The concept of long-range fighter escort remains relevant in modern conflicts. 15C and F-22 fighters escort B-2 and B-52 bombers. Aerial refueling extends the P-51's drop tank concept. Integrated air defense suppression protects strike aircraft. General Major Adolf Galland, inspector of fighters for the Luftwaffe, wrote in his memoir The First and the Last, published in 1954. The appearance of the Mustang over Germany in early 1944 was the beginning of the end for the Luftwaffe fighter arm. We could no longer choose when and where to fight. The Americans brought the battle to us on their terms. Technically, the Bf-109G6 could match the Mustang in some parameters. Our pilots at full strength might have fought them to a draw. But we had neither the fuel to train pilots nor the industrial capacity to replace losses. The Americans had both in abundance. The Mustang didn't just extend the bomber offensive, it transformed it. What had been a battle we might win became a battle we could only lose more slowly. The P-51's impact revolutionized air warfare doctrine. Fighter range became a priority. Post-war fighter designs emphasized range as much as performance. The concept that fighters are short-range point defense weapons died over Berlin in March 1944. Drop tanks became standard equipment for all fighters. Modern fighters like the F-16 and F-35 routinely fly with drop tanks. Air superiority as prerequisite. The P-51 proved that air superiority must be achieved before ground operations. This doctrine dominated NATO planning throughout the Cold War. Industrial warfare. Recognition that industrial capacity matters as much as tactical skill. Nations without industrial base couldn't sustain modern warfare. Military historians have assessed the P-51's impact. Dr. Richard Overy, in Why the Allies Won, published 1995. The P-51 Mustang was perhaps the single most important weapons system of the European air war. It made possible the daylight bombing campaign that destroyed German industrial capacity. Without it, the strategic bombing offensive would have failed. Operation Overlord might have been postponed or cancelled, and the war extended by years. Dr. John Keegan, in the Second World War, 1989. The arrival of the P-51B in numbers over Germany in early 1944 marked a watershed. The Luftwaffe had been an effective defensive force despite heavy losses. After March 1944, it became a spent force, capable only of sporadic resistance. Dr. Carlo D'Este, in Decision in Normandy, 1983. D-Day succeeded because the Allies owned the sky. The Luftwaffe managed only 319 sorties on June 6 versus 14,674 Allied sorties. This disparity resulted directly from the P-51's destruction of German fighter capability in spring 1944. The P-51 changed warfare fundamentally in several ways. Range revolutionized strategy. Geographic depth no longer protected industrial targets. Any target within 1,000 miles of enemy airfields became vulnerable. Fighter ascendancy. Fighters changed from supporting weapons to decisive weapons. Control of the air became the prerequisite for all other military operations. Training emphasis. The P-51's success with thoroughly trained pilots demonstrated that training quality matters more than aircraft numbers. Integrated systems. The Mustang succeeded as part of an integrated system: aircraft plus tactics, plus logistics, plus training, plus intelligence. This systems approach dominated post-war military thinking. Modern aircraft are direct descendants. The 15 Eagle was designed for long-range escort of bombers against the Soviet Union. Range: 3,000 miles with external tanks. Mission: achieve air superiority. Escort strike aircraft. Philosophy: not a pound for air to ground, initially, a pure fighter. The F-22 Raptor emphasizes stealth but retains long-range escort capability. Range: 1,840 miles. Supercruise allows efficient long-range flight. Designed to escort B-2 bombers deep into enemy territory. The F-35 Lightning II is multi-role but emphasizes range. Range 1,350 miles for the F-35A. Drop tanks available for extended missions. Network-centric warfare descends from P-51-era radio coordination. Units received recognition. The 354th Fighter Group received 2 Distinguished Unit citations. The first for development and execution of long-range escort missions, December 1943 through May 1944. The second for destroying large numbers of enemy aircraft in support of Operation Market Garden in September 1944. The 4th Fighter Group received a Distinguished Unit citation for destroying over 1,000 enemy aircraft, air and ground. Individual pilots were recognized. 39 pilots became aces with 5 or more victories in Mustangs. James Howard received the Medal of Honor, the only fighter pilot in the European theater so honored. Don Gentile received the Distinguished Service Cross and Distinguished Flying Cross with oak leaf clusters. Chuck Yeager received the Bronze Star and Distinguished Flying Cross. He later became the first to break the sound barrier. The P-51 remains the most recognizable World War II fighter in American culture. Over 150 airworthy examples exist worldwide as of 2024, featured in countless films: Red Tails, Pearl Harbor, Dunkirk, an airshow favorite with the distinctive sound of the Merlin engine, a symbol of American industrial and military achievement. The technical legacy continues. The laminar flow wing influenced jet fighter design. Drop tank technology is standard on all modern fighters. The bubble canopy became standard for visibility. The Meredith effect, thrust from the cooling system, is studied for modern applications. Consider the counterfactual. Without the P-51 Mustang with drop tanks, the strategic bombing campaign likely would have failed or been drastically scaled back. D-Day might have been postponed to 1945 or later. The war in Europe could have extended 1 to 2 years. Soviet forces might have occupied all of Germany and reached France. Thousands more Allied casualties were inevitable. The P-51 didn't just win the air war. It enabled victory in the entire European theater. The P-51's success enabled the strategic bombing campaign, which raises profound ethical questions. By making deep penetration bombing possible, P-51s indirectly contributed to civilian deaths. The Hamburg firestorm in 1943 killed over 40,000 civilians. Dresden in February 1945, 25,000 to 40,000 civilians killed. Countless industrial cities bombed with collateral damage. Fighter pilots who enabled these raids faced moral complexity. Were they protecting bomber crews doing a necessary job, or were they facilitating terror bombing? Captain William Harris, B-17 pilot, reflected in a 1989 interview, "The Mustangs saved my life. I flew 23 missions, and at least 5 times German fighters would have killed me if P-51s hadn't been there. I owe those pilots everything. But I also dropped bombs on German cities. Were there factories below? Were there also apartments, schools, hospitals? Yes. The Germans started it with Rotterdam and London. We finished it with Hamburg and Dresden. The Mustang made it possible for me to drop those bombs and come home alive. Was that good? I don't know. It was necessary, maybe. But good? That's harder to answer. General Karl Spaatz, commander of the Army Air Forces, Strategic Air Forces in Europe, defended the bombing campaign. We targeted military-industrial facilities, transportation networks, and oil production. These were legitimate military targets under international law. That civilians lived near these facilities was unavoidable. Germany chose to integrate war production into civilian areas, using their own people as human shields. The alternative was allowing Nazi Germany to continue its war of conquest and genocide. Every day the war continued meant more deaths in concentration camps, more cities destroyed, more millions murdered. Shortening the war by even months saved more lives than were lost in bombing campaigns. The P-51's enablement of strategic bombing was examined at Nuremberg, 1945 to 1946. The Allied prosecution faced a dilemma. German defendants argued that if Allied bombing of cities was legal, then German bombing of cities, the Blitz, was equally legal. The tribunal ruled, air bombardment of military objectives is legitimate. Where military and civilian targets are closely intermingled, the standards of proportionality and military necessity apply. The bombing of Germany's war-making capacity was legitimate military action. This established precedent but satisfied no one ethically. The 1949 Geneva Conventions, revised post-World War II, included provisions directly influenced by strategic bombing. Protocol 1, Article 51, Protection of civilian population. Indiscriminate attacks are prohibited. These include attacks not directed at specific military objectives, attacks which employ methods that cannot be limited, and attacks expected to cause excessive civilian loss compared to concrete military advantage. The P-51, by enabling precision daylight bombing, actually supported humanitarian law. Night bombing by the RAF was less discriminate. American daylight bombing, protected by P-51s, could target specific factories rather than area bombing entire cities. P-51 pilots had a clearer moral position than bomber crews. They were protecting fellow airmen from enemy fighters, clearly defensive, attacking enemy military aircraft, clearly legitimate, enabling bombers to hit military-industrial targets, legally justified. Most P-51 pilots experienced less moral conflict than bomber crews. They fought enemy combatants, not cities. Consider the counterfactual. What if P-51s hadn't existed? Scenario 1. Without long-range escorts, strategic bombing fails. Germany retains industrial capacity. War extends into 1946 and 1947. Additional casualties, military and civilian, far exceed those killed in bombing campaigns. Scenario 2. Allies abandon daylight bombing, switch entirely to night area bombing, the British approach. Less accurate, more civilian casualties, potentially less effective militarily. Scenario 3. Allies delay Overlord until 1945 to 1946. Achieve greater industrial and military superiority before invading. More time for the Holocaust, more Soviet advance into Europe, greater Soviet sphere of influence in the Cold War. By this analysis, the P-51 enabling precise strategic bombing was the most moral available option, though still involving terrible choices. March 4, 1944, 13:45 hours. Flight Officer Robert Johnson banks his P-51B little friend westward, leaving Berlin behind. Below, columns of smoke rise from the city. Around him, the bomber stream turns for home, still in formation, losses minimal. Johnson checks his fuel gauge, plenty remaining. He'll land at Debden, Essex, at approximately 1500 hours, 7 hours after takeoff. 7 hours in a single-engine fighter. 6 months ago, that would have been impossible. Looking back one last time, he sees no German fighters pursuing. They've learned. Chasing American bombers in the presence of Mustangs is suicide. The final statistics tell the story. Total P-51 Mustangs produced, 15,486. Enemy aircraft destroyed in air combat in Europe, 4,950. Enemy aircraft destroyed on ground, 4,131. Locomotives destroyed, 9,254. Combat sorties flown, 213,873. Combat hours, over 1.3 million. Operational losses, 2,520. For every P-51 lost in combat, German forces lost 3.6 aircraft. This exchange ratio, sustained over 18 months, bled the Luftwaffe white. When Berliners saw American bombers overhead despite Goering's promises, they began sardonically calling him Meyer. Air raid sirens became known as Meyer's trumpets. The psychological demolition of Nazi invincibility was complete. The P-51 with drop tanks didn't just extend bomber range. It rewrote the fundamental equations of air power. Geographic depth no longer provided sanctuary. Any target within 1,000 miles became vulnerable. Industrial dispersal couldn't escape fighter bombers. Small factories scattered across Germany were strafed relentlessly. Pilot training became impossible. Training fields deep in Germany, once safe, became shooting galleries for roving Mustangs. The Luftwaffe shifted from offense to survival. By summer 1944, German fighters scattered rather than concentrated, hoping merely to survive rather than win. The P-51 Mustang with drop tanks ranks among history's most decisive weapons systems. Greek fire that saved Constantinople, English longbow that dominated medieval warfare, dreadnought battleship that revolutionized naval combat, nuclear weapons that ended World War II and defined the Cold War. The P-51 Mustang that made strategic bombing viable and air superiority achievable. It wasn't the most powerful fighter of World War II. That honor belongs to late-war jets like the Me-262. It wasn't the most heavily armed. The P-47 carried twice the ordnance. It wasn't the most maneuverable. Spitfires could outturn it at low altitude. What made the P-51 decisive was range combined with capability. It could go anywhere and fight anyone on equal or better terms. That combination had never existed before and changed warfare permanently. The P-51's story teaches enduring lessons. Technology alone doesn't win wars. The P-51 succeeded because of superior pilot training, 200+ hours versus 50 hours. Better logistics, fuel, maintenance, spare parts. Sound doctrine, offensive fighter sweeps. Industrial capacity, over 15,000 produced versus Germany's inability to counter. Strategic clarity, protect bombers, destroy fighters, achieve air superiority. Adaptation beats perfection. The Mustang wasn't perfect. Early models had gun jamming issues. The fuselage fuel tank caused handling problems. The Allison-powered versions were inadequate. But North American aviation continuously improved the design based on combat feedback. German aircraft, designed for perfection, resisted modification. The Bf-109's basic design remained unchanged from 1937 to 1945. Systems thinking wins. The P-51 worked because it fit into a system. Drop tanks extended range. Improved radios enabled coordination. Better tactics. Finger four formation. Freed fighter doctrine. Industrial capacity provided numbers. Training pipeline provided skilled pilots. Logistics kept aircraft flying. Germany optimized individual components but failed at systems integration. Industrial warfare requires industrial capacity. Nazi Germany never understood modern warfare's industrial dimension. They believed fighting spirit and tactical excellence would overcome material disadvantages. They were wrong. America's industrial capacity, 50% of global manufacturing in 1944, proved unstoppable. Germany couldn't compete, especially while fighting a two-front war. Today, 80 years after P-51s first escorted bombers to Berlin, the principles remain relevant. F-35 fighters employ the P-51's concept, long-range, multi-role aircraft achieving air superiority to enable strike operations. Aerial refueling extends the drop tank concept. Modern fighters routinely operate thousands of miles from base. Integrated air defense descends from P-51 escort doctrine. Fighters protect strike aircraft from enemy interceptors. Network-centric warfare evolved from P-51-era radio coordination between fighters and bombers. March 4, 1944, 15:02 hours. Robert Johnson touches down at Debden after 7 hours aloft. Ground crew rush to his aircraft. He shuts down the Merlin engine, and in the sudden silence, he can hear it. Across the airfield, dozens of other Mustangs landing, the distinctive whistle of Merlins at idle power. 23 aircraft took off this morning. 22 returned. One pilot bailed out over Belgium and evaded capture. No losses to enemy action. Johnson climbs stiffly from the cockpit. His back aches, his mouth is dry, his legs barely support him. But he's alive. The bombers he protected are alive. And somewhere over Berlin, German commanders are realizing the war is lost. As Johnson walks toward the debriefing hut, he passes a crew chief painting a small swastika on a Mustang's nose, a kill marker. The chief looks up and grins. "How was Berlin, sir?" Johnson pauses, considering. How do you describe witnessing history change? How do you explain the moment when invincibility shatters? "Berlin," he finally says, "was ours." And it was. Hermann Goering had promised Hitler that no bombers would reach Berlin. But Goering's promise was made in September 1939, before anyone imagined long-range escort fighters, before external drop tanks, before American industrial might fully mobilized, and before the P-51 Mustang. The promise was broken, the sanctuary was shattered, and the air war over Europe would never be the same. The P-51 Mustang with drop tanks proved that in industrial warfare, innovation combined with production beats tradition combined with tactical excellence. It proved that range is a weapon as powerful as guns. It proved that protecting your forces matters as much as destroying the enemy's. Most importantly, it proved that seemingly impossible missions, like escorting bombers 500 miles into hostile territory, fighting for 30 minutes, and returning home, become routine when engineering ingenuity, industrial capacity, and operational doctrine align. When Hermann Goering saw Mustangs over Berlin, he knew the war was lost. The aircraft that rewrote the rules of air warfare had arrived, and with it came the end of the Third Reich's ability to defend its homeland. The drop tanks that made it possible were simple technology, aluminum shells or paper composite containers holding gasoline. But their impact was profound. They transformed the P-51 from an excellent fighter into a war-winning weapons system. Sometimes the simplest innovations create the most dramatic results. The P-51 with drop tanks was such an innovation, and it changed the course of history.